Hi everybody, I'm Greg Fishel. Welcome to bonus weather video number 2 for this week, and it is 11:04 p.m. when I am recording this, and I'm not recording it late because I took time out to watch the game, which has been a total disaster from the Mets standpoint. But it's one of those situations where I got an idea and then it just kept building on itself and building on itself and building on itself, and I probably made it way more complicated than it needed to be. But that is one of my many personality flaws. Speaking of the Mets, I am hoping that this World Series mimics the 1960 World Series, which was probably the most bizarre one in the history of baseball. The Yankees played the Pirates, and the Pirates won that series on a dramatic home run by Bill Mazeroski, I believe in the 9th inning of Game 7. But the Yankees outscored the Pirates 38-3 in 3 games, 16-3, 10-0, and 12-0, and they lost the series. Okay, so the Pirates won all their games by obviously much smaller margins, and the Yankees absolutely slaughtered them in those 3 games. So the Mets lost 9-0 in Game 1. Right now they're down 7-0 in the 9th of this one. So that's my only hope, is that this is mimicking that series, and I don't know that that hope is going to be realized. But anyway, we are here to talk about the weather. So we talk about normals a lot, and so I thought I would really do an in-depth study of what normals are and how they're calculated and how they've changed over time. So let me go ahead and put myself down here in the corner. And this is the 30-year normals, the actual 30-year normals computed by the National Center for Environmental Information. And this is based on the period 1991 to 2020. And then what I did was I went back and took a look at the actual 30-year averages of all 30 Januaries, 30 Februaries, 30 Marches. And these lines are so close to each other that it's barely worth or barely noticeable. The actual normals run about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees higher than the actual 30-year average. And you may be thinking, that sounds suspicious. That sounds like they're promoting an agenda here. Well, let's take a look at all the things that go into computing these 30-year normals. First of all, and this wouldn't be the case so much at a major airport like RDU, but there are other stations around that a lot of them are actually reported by regular old citizens. They take an observation once every 24 hours, and all that data goes into the climate record. So some of those stations may have missing data, observations, like maybe a couple of days the people, for whatever reason, didn't take observations, or the instruments were actually updated over time, okay? And so all of that has to at least be attempted to take that into account. Number 2, the station changes or may change locations over time. Well, that certainly has been the case at RDU, is that up until February of 1996, it was in a very good location for climate records, and then when the automated observing station was installed in February of 96 near the runway, that's when we started to have problems with some of these overinflated temperatures, especially during the summer months. But as I have told you ad nauseum over the years, all of that data is quality controlled with surrounding observations, and if it's so out of whack with the surrounding observations, it is either modified or completely thrown out, okay? So this climate record involves way, way more than just RDU and Asheville and Charlotte. When I first got to WRAL in 1981, I think there were only 10 or 11 stations that reported routinely every hour. I mean, you had Asheville, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh-Durham, Fayetteville, Wilmington, Cape Hatteras, and Elizabeth City. And then you had a couple of military stations like Seymour Johnson, Goldsboro, and so forth. But there weren't a lot of stations out there that reported hourly. Now I think there's over 70 in North Carolina. And even back at that time, there were a lot of these volunteer weather observers. The forestry department has some weather observations. There's tons and tons of data, and all of this is looked at to make sure that everything is consistent with the other sources of data. So I just want you to know that this is a very, very complicated and statistical process that has gone through. And the climate normals don't just include averages, they include statistics such as degree days. Now, for degree days, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but the base for a degree day is 65. And so if your average temperature for, let's say, July 15th is 75, then you have what are called 10 cooling degree days, because it's assumed that air conditioning is going to be needed, in a situation where it's 10 degrees above that base. If the temperature in January, let's say the average is 30, and the degree day base is 65, then you have 35 heating degree days. And degree days are used as an estimate as to how much energy is going to be required to heat or cool homes, depending on what time of year it is. And then you also have standard deviations, okay? Now, I'm sure you all remember looking at a bell curve, like supposing you have a classroom and there are 30 students and the majority of them are in the middle of that bell, and then you have the outliers, the high scores and the low scores that go out like this. Well, with standard deviations, it turns out that one standard deviation either side of the mean or the average is going to encompass, on average, about 68% of all the data, okay? If it's plus or minus 2 standard deviations, then that is going to encompass 95% of the data. And if it is plus or minus 3 standard deviations, and I have this in the next slide, it's 99.7. So if it's within 3 standard deviations, there's only going to be a couple of days, that are going to be outside of that. So here we go here, and yes, it is 68, 95, and 99.7. So what I did was I took a look at the actual 30-year average, not the normal, which is about 0.3 degrees higher, but the actual 30-year average for the first day of each month, okay? So the 30-year average goes from 52 on January 1st up to 90.4 on July 1st, and then back down to 58.2 on December 1st. Now, the standard deviation is much higher in the winter because the systems are more volatile, okay? You have more temperature contrast from north to south or east to west sometimes across the country. And so when a weather system goes by, it can suck up air that is a lot warmer than what you currently have, and then behind it, it can drag down air that is much colder than what you currently have, okay? So the range is much higher in the wintertime than it is during the summer when you simply don't have as much temperature contrast across the country, okay? So one standard deviation on January 1st goes from 41.2 to 62.8. So 68% of the time, you would expect the high to be in that range. And this is something that I lobbied for when I was at WRAL for years. We just never figured out an efficient way to do this. But when you say, oh, the normal high is 52 and the high was 55 today, so we were 3 degrees above normal, is that really significant? Or would it be better to say, hey, 68% of the time, the high is going to be between 41 and 62.8. So if the high is 55, is that really all that terribly unusual for January 1st? I don't think so, Now, you might want to do a whole standard deviation, but maybe a half of one or 3/4 of one. And so then instead of having a normal high, a specific number for the date, you would have a normal range. And that makes way more sense to me than assigning a specific number to each day. But that's just my personal opinion. Okay, so when you go to 2 standard deviations, the range on January 1st is 30.4 to 73.6. And when you go from 3 to 3 standard deviations, it's 19.6 to 84.4. Well, what's interesting is the record low max in January, and these records go all the way back into the late 1800s, is 17, and the record high for the month of January is 80. And those numbers aren't that far away from that 19.6 to 84.4. So all of this is done with the normals to give you an idea as to what to expect on a given date. Okay, so now here are the 30-year averages, and these are updated every 10 years because in general, if you look at a period of time any shorter than 30 years, you're not going to be able to establish any true trend in the climate, okay? You can't say that, oh, the last 3 years have been warmer than the previous 3, so that's climate change, okay? No, that doesn't work that way, okay? You've got to look at an extended period of time. But it is interesting to note that if you go back and look at these averages from 61 to 90, and they update every 10 years, 71 to 2000, 81 to 2010, and 91 to 2020, each one of those is just a little bit higher than the one before it, okay? But what I found interesting is that the biggest increases from one 30-year period to the next occurred early in January and February. During the transition season, the spring season, there really wasn't that much difference. And then you had significant increases up here in the heat of the summer. Again, not much change during the fall, and then slightly bigger changes, not as big as here, but slightly bigger changes as we went into the month of December. So the biggest changes occurred in the beginning, the middle, and the end of the season, and during the spring and the fall period, the changes weren't as significant. I'm not smart enough to give you an answer on why that is, but what I did was I graphed that, and you can see that the increase was over 3 degrees over those 4 30-year periods in January and February. Then it dropped off to less than 1.5 degrees in March, went back up to 2.5 degrees in June and July, and then came back down to a little bit more than 1.5 degrees in October, and then went back up to more than 2 degrees in December, okay? So I just thought that was interesting, that you would have thought, I would have guessed, to be honest with you, my hypothesis would have been is that the biggest increases would have been in the summer due to the fact that there were these issues at the RDU airport, with the summer heat and being near a runway and all that sort of stuff. But the biggest increases of all actually occurred in the coldest time of the year in January into the early portions of February. So that surprised me. It really, really did. So fun with numbers, right? Okay. So that's all I could pull out of all these normals and averages and standard deviations for this date. I wanted to get it out before the date changed, and it is now, let me look up here, it is now 11/16 as I finish this. So I probably will, I'm guessing that most of you won't see this until tomorrow, but if some of you do, more power to you. I hope you have a wonderful what's left of your Wednesday evening, and we will talk to you again much earlier tomorrow. All right, folks, you all take care, and we'll talk to you soon. See you later.